Good evening, everyone. I'm Jamie Boyer. I'm the Vice President for Education here at the New York Botanical Garden, and thank you for coming to today's event, Forms, Weeds, and Real Life with renowned landscape architect, Shannon Nichol. The lecture tonight is the first in our landscape design portfolio series, which has been made possible through the generous support of Monica Heimbolt. Monica, I think you're out there, so thank you very much for all you have contributed to us. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the New York Botanical Garden is located on the ancestral lands of the Lenape Delaware people. We honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. In addition to today's program, the garden offers many classes, workshops, and public lectures in landscape design, horticulture, gardening, and more. I'd like to highlight a few of the upcoming events. On October 24th, in person in the Mertz Library Reading Room at the Garden, we will have a special talk with garden historian and author Marta McDowell about her book, Gardening Can Be Murder. Our second portfolio series will take place online on October 29th with Shane Cohen's talk, Context, Form, and Equity. And on November 19th, our portfolio series concludes with Laura Stimson's lecture on wildness, lost landscapes, and belonging. Now I'd like to introduce Susan Cohen. She's our coordinator of the Landscape Design Certificate Program and is a longtime instructor here at the Garden. Susan has been coordinating our Landscape Design Portfolio Series since 1998 and has been instrumental in bringing outstanding landscape architects from around the world to share their design visions with a New York audience. Thank you, Susan, for all that you do for the garden and the community. Susan.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you also to the hidden people behind the scenes, the NYBG staff who are just off camera, who make these programs happen. And welcome to the 26th Annual Landscape Design Portfolios, a series that was founded, as Jamie said, to present the work of national and also international landscape architects and designers to a New York area audience. Now, through Zoom, we can share our outstanding speakers more widely in multiple time zones. This year, we highlight designers moving from west to east, based in Seattle, Minneapolis, and then Massachusetts. And we are delighted to welcome Seattle's renowned Shannon Nichol today. In 1999, three inventive and somewhat audacious women founded a landscape architecture firm in Seattle called GGN after their initials. Jennifer Guthrie and Catherine Gustafson were the two G's, and Shannon Nichol was the N. GGN, which now has 45 employees, has become well known for its excellence in landscape design. And they're the subject of a book which was in about 2018, I think. If you're more interested in the firm, you might want to pick up Thaisa Wei's very interesting and well-illustrated book about the firm. Shannon Nichol grew up in Whatcom County, Washington. I just learned that today, Shannon. And which is described as a gem of the Northern Cascades, nestled within lush forests and picturesque coastal views. Her practice, she says, was influenced by growing up on a mountain logging road and observing the interactions between people, plants, and animals. Her well-known affinity for using local native plants stems in part from 15 years of using them in her own garden. Shannon is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and an honorary member of the American Institute of Architects in recognition of her important contributions to that field. Among many other honors, she and her partners received Smithsonian's 2011 Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Landscape Architecture and the 2017 ASLA National Landscape Architecture Firm Award. Shannon's projects have also been recognized with multiple ASLA National Awards of Excellence. This evening, she will discuss, among other projects, Chicago's beloved Laurie Garden at Millennium Park, the Gates Foundation campus in Seattle, and a Seattle private residence known as Native Gardens. She's titled her talk, as you heard, Forms, Weeds, and Real Life. Thank you for joining us, Shannon, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Susan and Jamie, for that really gracious introduction. I'm so honored to be part of this series and to represent the West Coast in the survey of our landscape architecture community with the series this year. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to focus the talk tonight, because this is a botanical garden, on my relationship with plants as a landscape architect over the last 25 years, which has been dynamic. It's changed. It's been tortuous at times. And I think those of us who are landscape architects or aspiring to be them know that there's kind of a loaded relationship and sometimes skepticism about landscape architects' relationship with plants, or even ability sometimes to get outside and interact with plants. So I'm going to talk about that and some of the collaborations that I've had over the years in connecting people to place and including plants in that effort. There's always that pause of the first transition. I'm definitely a little intimidated to speak to an audience for a botanical garden, because our firm may be most known for work in materials that aren't plants. Our start as a firm, as Susan was referencing, in the late 90s and early 2000s, we really enjoyed digging into working with stone, water, relating to architecture, and advocating for landscape as being something that could be as controlled and conceptually thought through of a medium or a realm of thinking as architecture or art might be. And I think in that time, in the early 2000s, felt like that was a point that needed to be explored or proven. And we felt like we were part of that. It was really exciting. This is City Center, DC. And at the ASLA convention, a lot of folks took photos of this and didn't know who designed it or when, but were sort of fascinated by this water feature. So it was fun to get a lot of photos from friends and people I didn't know. Our work has been, as landscape architects, has been closely intertwined with architecture and art. This is National Portrait Gallery in DC. The plants and the gardens that we've done have been in odd situations, a lot of times like very artificial. This is completely inside. And the great plantsman and explorer, who's also from the Seattle area, Dan Hinckley, did the planting for this, simulating a temperate landscape with collage together from all over the world that had a chance of surviving in this low art-friendly humidity and low UV light. Foster and Partners doing the roof here. Our job here, and we love that job, was really to mesh together different areas of architecture, complement everything, provide seating, and at times be invisible. We also started to enjoy in the early 2000s to mid 2000s, finding ways to connect people to and make them comfortable in places that seem like you shouldn't be able to be comfortable in. So there's a theme here of, even as artful as the work might have been perceived of some of the projects I just showed you, like our early museum projects, we love detailing and being precise about it. We're often thinking of ourselves as fixing something or solving problems, which starts to lead into where I ended up going with plants. in the North End Parks in Boston, which is part of the Rose Kennedy Greenway, we're on a very shallow rooftop over tunnel ramp parcels. So there's ramps coming up from the buried Big Dig project right underneath here. And we worked around those tolerances and the weight bearing capabilities and things like that to try to make people feel like they're not on two traffic islands surrounded by surface artery southbound and these tunnel openings, and make them feel like they are at the front porch of the North End neighborhood, which is a wonderfully textured and really embedded place. So grounding people on places that feel like they're disconnected or have been disconnected for some time and reconnecting them to place is something we're always trying to do. We also have had the privilege of working on projects where the landscape is introducing people to something really bigger than itself. This is the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And our job here was very much to just get people kind of in a new frame of mind as they approach this incredible Corona building that looks like it's landed from space on the mall. The reason why it looks like it's landing on the mall and right next to the, as it should, right next to the Washington Monument at the center of our nation's story is because we worked really hard to create the illusion hopefully without it appearing that we worked hard to do it, that the regular lawn of the National Mall just extends underneath and around this building. There's roadways in our view here that we're very carefully, we've graded things. This is a sort of an odd corner outside of that central intersection of the mall. So it was in some people's minds a side, kind of a side location, and we wanted it to feel central. So grading, simplicity, restraint, and real focus on often on someone else's story or someone else's work is part of what we do as well, which starts to set up a mindset toward really focusing on communities and ecology, but we didn't realize it at the time that we were doing a lot of these more architecturally driven or sculpturally driven landscapes in the early part of our firm's trajectory. So just as a continuation of that, we still do a lot of work that's very closely related to architecture of all eras. We love bringing some contrast and freshness. This is the Sydney New Modern wing in Australia for the Modern Art Museum there. Sana did a new space there, a new gallery. And we did this landscape to bring an accessible entry, universally accessible entry, and some new features to this space. So a lot of my career, especially the earlier part of my career, has been spent working with architects on how to start to think about the building as part of the landscape, or at least what is the relationship with the landscape. And a lot of times there's no necessarily right or wrong answer or good or bad, but if we don't come in and help them see what the landscape is and or what it should be, and maybe we just haven't been able to see it for the last few decades because of alterations that have happened, see the landscape and then see there are choices that are very distinct with how your building can relate to this landscape. It can be part of a forest, part of that sort of mesh of texture or reef or scaffold as you see on the left, or it can have some kind of ground that is overtly separated and framed and artificial, and then let the more variable, organic and old conditions have a very precise boundary. So I've done thousands of drawings like this in my career of really asking the question, how can we make this clear and meaningful? Because it helps the landscape and helps people understand the landscape and then appreciate it and appreciate the differences of each place if the architecture understands that landscape and responds to it in a clear way and not just sort of a default way, or simply looking at it as white space that's around the outside of a 3D model that's being spun around on somebody's laptop, or that minty green fill color that landscape always has. So more recently, this Saturday, I'm super excited going to the opening of this project. This is India Basin Shoreline Park in San Francisco in the Hunters Point Bayview neighborhood. This is an example of a project where we did this in 2016 was when we started the design, and phase 1 is opening now. It's a huge project because it involves environmental cleanup. So it's been a long running project with a really rich public process. But as you can see here, this looks like it should be an Italian hill town, and this neighborhood should be able to freely walk up and down to the shoreline here. But there's a lot of barriers over the last decade, some of them social, racial, economic, and then just physical barriers. So our concept, which we illustrated with a series of these really basic cartoons, was about creating a waterfront park that isn't at first glance as much about creating a fancy green continuum in the crosswise or lengthwise direction that's parallel to the waterfront, but very much emphasizing the local connections and the daily life, and extending that up into the neighborhood, and then extending this kind of human interface in place of the industrial as this series of piers and walkways and crossings. So that's opening phase 1, which would be in the sort of the center of the picture. Doesn't look exactly like that, but it's opening this weekend. And I'm not going to get into detail on it because I wanted to sort of move into some other projects and plant explorations for this talk, but we're very excited about that project. So circling back a little bit to process and how we work, hand drawing is something that's been pretty central in our practice for all of us. For me, it helps me clearly advocate for something that sometimes I'm not able to word myself or advocate verbally in a way that's really bold or aggressive sounding, as you probably can tell from maybe the way I'm bumbling around with my words. So if I do a drawing, I can share with other people a pretty radical way of seeing a site, something that other people may have missed, or a radical idea for repairing it or making it, amping it up and making it more like what it is. So this is an example. This project, we have a highway going through an old farm, and this drawing probably just looks kind of mild and charming, but idea of putting the land back in alignment, the planted features, which happen to here be very rustic hedgerows, and there's native big leaf maples on either side of the highway that we're proposing to make into more of a symmetrical gateway. But if we line up the features on either side of the highway, which over time, after this modern highway was put in, the land had evolved to be treated like separate parcels. With the highway is something that, you know, everybody turns their back to it, and then nothing crosses the highway. So the highway really transformed the landscape and made it feel smaller and broken down. So the idea here is show that this is one piece of ground, and it has been for tens of thousands of years. It's one piece of ground. The highway's the latecomer. There's fast cars on it, but it's this small one-time thing that's been laid down over the top of this bigger piece of ground. So part of the reason why I'm pretty interested in the way that plants and nature heal and take over from things, and the timeline of plants and human disturbance and recovery, is that I did grow up, as mentioned, on a logging road. On the left here is an image just off my parents' property of a clear cut that I think I've seen this piece cut 3 or 4 times in my lifetime. On the right is an old logging road that's on my parents' property. And there's a bunch of those old logging roads. And they're being reclaimed by the forest. And then some of them, there's some minimal efforts that my family makes to keep them as pathways. But something about that process and the traces of the original nature and the traces of the disturbance, and then the brain wanting to make sense of what came first and at what rate is what happening. When those things mix together, we get really interesting landscapes, but we also, I think, get a lot of hope because you're seeing something healing. And for me, it's exciting to see things grow back. I have had the luxury of being in a landscape in the Pacific Northwest because it's been so recently colonized. When you do one of these clear cuts, there's almost no native plants that are in the plants that are regrowing. So you're still seeing so much intact information that's richly been developed over tens of thousands of years, probably about 25,000 years there. It was pretty recently glaciated, so not as long of a time period as you have further east. But you get to see real life and what really happens if we do something, what's nature's reaction. And getting that true story or pretty close to it, it taught me a lot, and it was a luxury. And when I come to an urban area or an area that's been disturbed for a longer period of time, it's much more difficult and challenging to understand what is natural, what is older, what is newer. But I think it's human nature, and there's been interesting studies and books written about this, to want to understand that in the landscapes around us. So as landscape architects, we're often having to artificially create that integrity in the landscapes that we design, and artificially create that richness and complexity and interest. And I think we need to create those processes that it's not just a static picture that we're making or a static plant installation, but something that's growing, recovering, from whatever disturbance we have to something richer and more healthy. And I think we can do that while still being formal and sculptural and all those kinds of things. So this is a more recent picture. This is last year. Just I love camping in the clear cuts and botanizing, and I get all sorts of ideas for gnarly, heat tolerant, tough as nails plants that actually are really suited to urban conditions and disturbed sites that we work on. So I pull a lot of my horticultural ideas for the Pacific Northwest projects from clear cuts. And to me, I think it's pretty easy to bust the myth that, quote, nothing's native to urban conditions in the Pacific Northwest. It's not true. We have things that joyously colonize the crummiest hell strips or builders fill, gravel, parking lot strips, whatever. They're available. We just haven't explored them fully yet. So when we started the firm, I just completed a bunch of projects like this. I got right into restoration after I kind of accidentally stumbled into landscape architecture, but I figured I'd be doing restoration. So I kind of glommed onto weed plants from the beginning. And this is a installation at a Seattle park with Alnus rubra, like 4 to 6 feet on center, which is how it would grow if it was recolonizing a place. And I was really lucky to have a boss that let me do this as pretty much a student, Charles Anderson and Ray. So this is one of the installations. This is a few years after installation, and then this is a more recent image. And it's made me happy to see it grow over the years. And nobody knows at this point that it was designed, which is great by me. So I was doing that work, and that's when Catherine Gustafson, who had only been practicing in Europe at that point, and she'd been doing projects like Shell Petroleum headquarters at the top there, which is so killer, right? It's so perfectly tailored and sculpted and sensuous and provocative just with its form. And, to put this in context, this is in the land art movement. Her work really it became really visible in the 90s, and she trained as a sculptor before she went into landscape. So she had seen some graphics that I had done because I love drawing, and I'd done some graphics for a project in Seattle. And through somebody she knew, I ended up meeting her, and I think very much disappointing her with what a hillbilly I was. But she always has had a really great sense of adventure and kind of sees things in people that other people might miss. So I ended up doing the graphics for her entry in this competition for the Arthur Ross Terrace at the American Museum of Natural History, which is in your city. And that kind of jolted me out of this local restoration world and into this series of museum projects. And we worked together really well. Catherine was always looking and has always been so talented at making a statement, figuring out kind of how to knock the socks off of people. And I've always been fascinated by trying to dig in and find the true story of each site and knocking the socks off of people as I would fantasize with whatever that real story is that they might be missing, that's just hidden underneath the ground. So the first chance that we got to put all of that together was at the Lurie Garden in Chicago. We did this as a competition that we were pretty sure we were accidentally invited to right after we started the firm. So Jennifer, Catherine, and I, right after we started the firm, we got this fax that said that part of Millennium Park was going to be a botanical garden, and that it would feature rare and unusual plants from all over the world that could be, no, it didn't say from all over the world. It said rare and unusual plants that could be found nowhere else in the world. That's pretty much the exact wording. So I thought when I saw that, it would be interesting if those rare and unusual plants that could be found nowhere else in the world but Chicago were Chicago's own plants, which at the time in the year 2000 was a pretty risky idea until we realized that Pete Udolph was on the list, who had only been working in Europe at that point, but he was using plants from this region in mind-blowing ways. So we brought him on the team. And then Catherine brought her sense of the monumental, the holding the ground, making a statement. And we kind of combined all those things together. This landform we have for the Lurie Garden that's here shown in this plaster cast of our model. The whole idea was that this really burly energy was pushing up from below the site. This is on a 6th floor rooftop over the top of a city parking garage that's underneath Millennium Park. So here we are on structure again. And in studying Chicago, studying the site, studying how Chicago raised itself up out of a marsh in the way that the whole city is constructed, this upward energy was pretty fascinating to us. So we thought, what if there's a botanical garden that's basically this place where it's almost like there's this crack in the constructed ground of the city, and the native energy and native plants kind of push their way up. And in my mind, when we were working on this and working on the forms, I was thinking of an old toy that most of you probably won't remember, but there was a Play-Doh barbershop toy that you would push up on the bottom, and there was holes and the Play-Doh would come out of the holes like hair. So I was thinking of like a push-up pop or something like that with these perennial plates and this big 14-foot high swollen profile hedge that holds it all in. So this is what it looks like in full photographic realization with Pete's incredible planting, which interpreted our conceptual ideas, not with entirely native plants, but enough that people were very much taking notice and fascinated by it. And then over time, with an amazing endowment that the Lurie family has provided, really creative gardening teams, horticulture teams, evolved the garden, and it's now in the 85% range of locally native plants, which is pretty incredible. And it is a botanical garden, but in our mind, we thought we were doing something pretty different in saying this is a botanical garden that is more like a surface that you walk through and this kind of place. And then the hedge was really important because we did feel we were taking big risks, especially with the winter interests before everyone understood Pete's work. We wanted the hedge to be really in your face and unmistakably always there, and also cutting out the middle ground so that the competition from all the incredible stainless steel objects and LED of Millennium Park would be blocked out, but you would see the city. It was really important to us that you see this real nature in the city. Chicago's a beautiful city, right? So the form of it really came from discovering, as we dug into old maps and read everything we could about Chicago, that one of the original shorelines of the city passes right underneath our site. So we have this diagonal boardwalk with a water feature that divides the two perennial plates. What we kind of think of as the old and the new, the thick, old, marshy Chicago landscape, which Pete interpreted in different ways, and there's more shade, and we sunk the paths so that your body feels a little more like you're wading through plants. People used to only be able to get around Chicago, or the part of Chicago where the loop is, mostly by canoe. And then the dry plate, or the light plate, the human body is elevated. You have more power, more sight line. We created a ridge and you can see out to the lake. So you feel very much in control, which is the narrative of the modern Chicago landscape. So here's this combination of our kind of monumental sculptural approach with the ecological and the sensory gentle stuff. My son, when he was much younger, so there's this moment of being allowed in by this giant hedge, and then you come into the garden, and we want you to feel like you're not quite sure how big the space is that you're in, and really focus on the plant and the plants and Pete's art with them. And then it's really important as a goal that people see that I'm still in a city and I'm in a real place, and I know what the real story of this place is. Is this a literal restoration? No. But is it of Chicago? Unmistakably only in Chicago? We feel yes. And really served as a template for what we tried to do in terms of the feelings that we might be able to give people about their home place in all of our work. And I've been really lucky to have an ongoing relationship with the Lurie Garden and Millennium Park folks, Pete, coming back year after year, continuing to learn, continuing to navigate things as they get to that 20-year mark, which they did this year. It's been really rewarding. So anyway, got back to Seattle after the Lurie Garden opened in 2004 and thought, oh, okay, we're working around the world and we can see this change or shift starting to happen, that people are a little more interested in knowing what their native plants are and not just imitating gardens from other places. But this is a recent Google search. So I got back in 2004 and I thought, let's do this in Seattle. Seattle needs a Lurie Garden, or it needs a Pete Udolph, or it needs that kind of movement. Just as a spoiler alert, that has not happened. And these are all beautiful gardens. You look up Seattle Garden or you walk around Seattle neighborhoods and there's beautiful gardens everywhere. But the inspiration does not seem to come from this place, which I find endlessly fascinating for a place that people move to be close to nature. But I think in people's minds, it's you get in your Subaru and you drive 45 minutes and go on a hike. There's all sorts of incredible plants, people, and talent, and nurseries here, and knowledge, and very little of a sense of cohesion or local place, which I think is a loss, and it's also a loss ecologically. So the first major project that I worked on after the Lurie Garden, where I thought, okay, well, let's show people how beautiful our native plants can be, was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is also on a rooftop, but it is also collecting rainwater and treating it. And at the time, really innovative ways. NBBJ is the architects here. So for this project, we use big leaf maples, which are considered a weed tree. a junk tree. They're banned from City of Seattle right-of-ways. I think that might be about to finally change. And native reeds and other plants. For the shady areas, this was pretty straightforward to find those plants in nurseries, because people do think of native plants as being plants that go with non-native rhododendrons and Japanese maples and the typical Seattle plant palette. But this site was historically a wet meadow. And we thought, well, with the focus on water and absorbing water and handling it, and then the history of the site as a wet meadow, it would be interesting to treat this as inspiration for plantings. And so we also found out that the meadow that this site sits on for thousands of years had been cultivated as a garden by our indigenous neighbors, our Coast Salish neighbors. And it was a meeting place. It was stunning to the first European people who saw it, and they called it a garden, and also in the same sentences said how amazing it will be to turn the pigs and cows out onto it. And we have no photos of it. We just have descriptions. But we do know that Kilmassia liked linii, which at the point that we did this project, I'd only seen in Dutch bulb catalogs, even though I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. We do know that Kilmassia liked linii was cultivated in this meadow. So we put it in the plantings here at the Gates Foundation, and it does great in the full sun. Where we fell short, and this is 2004, 2005, is in the sun, the rest of that matrix of sun plantings, and being told over and over again, well, there's just no native plants that'll work in the sunny areas of the site. We couldn't find native sun tolerant plants and grasses that we felt confident using at that time. So we used Phenacedum Little Bunny and Hamelin, that one that's so hard to say. We used your region's native dwarf blueberry, Vaccinium angustifolium, and a cultivar of that. And this massing is very successful. It still looks like this. The Kilmassia liked linii punches right up through it every year. It's a powerful plant. But it left me knowing that there was a lot I didn't know about my home region's landscape. As you saw, I grew up in the woods. I saw the plants that came in after clear cuts. What I didn't know was what used to be in the lowland, flat, open areas. What used to grow there? Like, if I'd never seen camas with my own eyes growing up, what about all the plants that it grew with? And those must be sun tolerant meadow type plants as well, that would be well suited to fine scaled and sunny, hot, dry urban situations that aren't in a forest. So being a bit frustrated from the Gates Foundation project, in that we had all the time, we had all the client support, all the financial resources to obtain these plants, but they just weren't available. I started to see that GGN, and meanwhile, GGN had become the largest independent landscape architecture firm in the Pacific Northwest. I realized we had the platform and the obligation to see how we can move the needle in the Pacific Northwest in ways I'd seen it happening in the other regions that we'd work. I saw how in Chicago, when the Lurie Garden went in, Roy Diblick's wonderful nursery, Northwind Perennials, started to become very well known, and the plants that he was promoting and had grown and incorporated into the Lurie Garden were being sold in other nurseries. People were asking for them. There were echinacea and prairie drop seeds suddenly in the Magnificent Mile in Chicago, which seems normal now, but at the time that was something new. And I wanted to see that, see how we could help with that, and also maybe help with some other things too. So made friends with Tom Alberg and Judy Beck, who have a nonprofit called Oxbow Conservation Center, and they have a native plant nursery there that was completely dedicated to being an open source icebreaker for propagating and developing methods for growing, commercially growing native plants. And they're the only ones I knew doing that. So we had a bunch of events and panels and collaborated, and that was just a wonderful learning experience for me. that also made me realize you can't just say, let's start doing this and it'll happen. The industry, the nursery industry, and the things that needed to be figured out were substantial, but these were the people doing it. I also had a kid, and so this is 2012, and when we were living in a very urban neighborhood, Queen Anne, with, we would go for walks and it would be like I Spy, and we'd go 2 blocks before we'd spy a native plant. And so I would bring him up to my family's place quite a bit because I felt like he needed to know the regular ground of this place, the real ground. And I started to think about how strange that was that I had to do that. And then why is it important? And all of those things combined to, with myself and my collaborators at GGN, that we just switched our practice to being all native plants. We know that being absolutely purist 100% isn't the only way to go. We have lots of friends we adore who aren't 100% native plants. We know it's idealistic, but we felt like we needed to give ourselves creative and artistic constraints in our work to kind of do some catch up and to force ourselves to figure this out. Like, this has to be something we can figure out. So these are all photos from Seattle pollinator gardens. So Seattle is so good-hearted, and the folks are very well read. They're really up on trends. Pollinator gardens have been really big in Seattle. These are all recent photos, and anyone who may be familiar with Seattle or just Pacific Northwest species might know that these are native species in your part of the world, but not Seattle. There's one native species mentioned here and one in one of these photos. But what you see a lot in Seattle, and it's by some measures, the #1 place in the country for yard signs. So we have lots of signs that say stuff like, we also like bumper stickers, but a lot of signs that say things like, we believe in science, and, watch out, wildlife and bee saving going on, and things like that, pollinator this or that. But there's a lot of those signs in front of wonderful plants that are probably feeding pollinators, generalist pollinators, which is great, but they don't tell us where we are in the world. They don't teach our kids anything about this place. They teach kids about other places, which, if that's what you want to do, that's great, or if you want a certain color scheme. But things are mislabeled, and that's something that was frustrating me also as a parent. So people are very concerned, get involved with their yards here with the monarch crisis, and watching what a wonderful example that's been in other parts of the country has been super interesting. But you can see from the Cersei Society graphic, like, we're the blue, no milkweed, no monarchs here. We have lots of other butterflies, and we're all still fascinated and concerned for the monarchs and following that. But we need to figure out our own causes and our own animals and plant connections in the Pacific Northwest. So I got any books I could. I have book lists I can share after this if anyone's interested. There's not many. There weren't many books, and there still aren't many, that say what plant produces what insect. What insect is completely dependent on what co-evolved plant to exist. In our region, there's less of that. We have Doug Tallamy's book telling us about the concept and based in research from another region, but we don't have our Doug Tallamy quite yet here. So I started cobbling together what I could find of information and online, what snippets of academic papers I could get, and books, to just educate myself about, when I, as a landscape architect, am putting plants in the ground, what animals am I affecting? And an interesting example is this butterfly that I grew up seeing quite a bit of, the cedar hair streak, which has had so many name changes in the last 2 or 3 years that they're all kind of floating down there. But it's a good example. So you might see it nectaring on a bunch of different flowers and then think, oh, well, my garden's supporting this butterfly, but its eggs are only laid on Thuya plicata, which is the western red cedar. Some of them may also lay on Calocedrus decurrens, which is further south relative, but it's quite exclusive. And learning that our version of some of these hyperproductive species are conifers and or are maybe not as flashy as some of the plants and animals that we want to focus on was kind of interesting to me the more I dug into things. And the other thing that I like to show folks in the Pacific Northwest, we do have one oak species that just barely peppers up towards Seattle. And there's even theories that they only are peppered up here because our indigenous neighbors cultivated them with camas meadows, brought them up and sustained them, because in the places where they were during colonization, they're being crowded out by Douglas fir forests now with cultivation. So, but there's still an ideal that oaks and northeast prairie species are ecological gardening, because you've all done such a good job of educating yourselves and creating really great information resources. We need to do the same in the Pacific Northwest. So back to more self-education, trying to learn about these urban, heat-tolerant, small prairie plants. Do we have them? Yes, we do. That was a big surprise, but I could not find any in nurseries. And I realized for GGN to use them, I needed to know what they looked like. Did I like the way they looked? How do I mix them together aesthetically? Will they be a sustainable matrix that covers the ground and looks good all year round? So I, with my son as my means of urban wilderness exposure, we started this project of growing these plants from seeds we found online, seeds we collected in the landscape near my parents' place, seeds we collected in clear cuts, roadsides, ditches, vacant lots. And then we just started being blown away by, I mean, it seems like immaculate conception, but when we plant the right plants and enough of them, really interesting insects come that are closely associated with these plants, not necessarily for reproduction, but for foraging. And so we started studying them. I started taking, I hadn't drawn like this for years and years because I'd been doing design drawing. But I started studying these species. I won't get into each of them. And bees are kind of last, because bees, I think, have a lot of support, a lot of interest. They're cute, they're fuzzy. But I also became really interested in being able to identify them, and then also understand, sweat bees are generally on their Erigeron and the Symphyiotrichum, just like they are in your region, but we have our own kind of analogous associations between genus of plant and bee. Then I started really looking at how can I campaign or get people in the Pacific Northwest to see their native plants and animals as part of their culture. So I kind of toyed with doing fabric design. This is Camassia, ranunculus, and plectridis. What if we had this on tea towels, like in the spring, rather than daffodils and tulips? Why is that what Easter is? Other associations, moths, Omlaria in the spring. And then I did with my home garden, this very, as you can see in comparing it to my other landscape work, very cozy, purposely cozy, accessible style garden with 100% native plants. And really focus on things that I know are the Achilles heel of native plant gardening in our region, which it needs to look neat. It needs to have really full, dense, cute, pillowy edges. What happens to those edges over time and seasons? Needs to have flowers. Looking at annuals. Annuals are very useful, so we don't need to use mulch. And developing overseeding techniques. This is annuals. This is Colomia grandiflora in the foreground here with some Clarkia. And then purposely not watering during 106-degree record-setting heat waves and seeing what happens. Those test beds really taught us a lot for use in our projects. And then I was sharing those things online and in my Instagram account. And in particular, Heracleum maximum kind of fascinated people that I liked it so much. And so if you look up hashtag Heracleum Appreciation Society, you'll find this really lovely community of people who kind of excuse me, connected with me. And we all connected with each other about realizing that this weed that often gets confused for Heracleum mantagasianum, which is the Russian invasive that everyone's so scared of. This is not the same plant, and it's valuable. It produces tons of insects, and it's just been fun to get people to discover, like, maybe this weed's okay, and then see a garden designer putting it in a client's garden. That led us, and this is where I'll close, that led us to launch something called Meadow Shop, the Meadow Shop initiative at GGN, where we thought, and this has been, because I always get this question, it has been a loss leader so far, but we thought, what if we kind of simplify what we do and give smaller scale property owners, like people more like me, the tools and designs, and connect them with suppliers and gardeners to have a native garden. Our first project, or kind of our pilot project for that, was this project, Seattle Native Gardens, where the owners are incredible. They really wanted a project that would surround them with plant energy, and they wanted to be honest. This is a disturbed site. A house was torn down, a new one was built. It's this small urban lot. There's a sidewalk just outside that railing. This is a sunken garden outside of a basement, and we just planted the blankety blank out of it with all sorts of naughty stoloniferous brute plants that people say you shouldn't put in gardens because they spread, and that's what we wanted. And in a few years, and I'm going to meet with the gardener, Sue Dixon, who's amazing, next week. We keep in constant contact. In a few years, this is going to evolve into something else as the larger woody plants start to cast more shade on this. But you can see Heracleum, you can see Devil's Club, skunk cabbage, stink currant, all these really rudely named plants, named by explorers and settlers who had no appreciation for the vegetation of the region. And also developing a hardscape aesthetic that in our minds is more affordable, more modular, and kind of works better with the sense of this Western raw recolonizing of plants, this look that we were going for. And this is me showing Jenny Harris and some other Seattle area gardeners that we ended up with a Betula nigra, where we thought we had Papyrifera, which is a common risk in Pacific Northwest gardens, to end up with plants from other regions, because it's so hard to find the native plants. So some of the methods that I developed in my little yard test gardens were used for our longtime commercial clients. Again, here's the Gates Foundation annuals. The University of Washington allowed us to do this experimental plot at Founders Hall with plectritis, that annual. And then there's a larger idea that could Denny, the sort of central oldest meadow and field, which is on a pretty steep hillside, could that be rewilded? And then the Burke Museum, Natural History Museum in Seattle with Olson Kundig architects. Here you see us getting to apply those planting methods on a larger scale, which is a real privilege. And again, kind of circling back to the concept of a botanical garden. What if it's a place, not only a place, but a place where you're learning from your Indigenous neighbors today and learning from them about the future and how to garden today. It's particularly focusing on that Camas Meadow garden, which was such an important and continues to be such an important central part of food and medicine. And it was the places the cows were first released. We learned a lot from the Council of Elders and our Indigenous partners on the project. Everything from realizing that it can be traumatic for them to see plants that they have only ever known as being in the ground forever, as being in what one elder called test tubes. And learning that we need to really understand how much these plants are family members to people who have been here for millennia. So there's the first year, the first camas, here it is now. You see the Erigeron speciosus is really stealing the show here, but in a good way. We had mislabeled lupin. It's native, but it wasn't the species we thought it would. So our office has actually gotten a chance to come out and help thin lupin with Polly Olson, who's of Yakima tribe representation. She's the tribal liaison for the Burke and has been leading volunteer efforts. Your eastern cottontail, we don't have native rabbits here, but I can blame it on you all. They've been here and our native plants can't take rabbit browsing. And so our indigenous collaborators have been helping to develop experiments and ideas about how to keep rabbits out without using unhealthy materials or even profane, potentially. Things like rebar and things like that can be shocking and offensive and unhealthy to put near the medicinal plants. So learning a lot and really appreciate the chance to be able to share it with you all. So I'm just gonna, for a purpose of time, I'm gonna skip through this last project because I wanna be sure we have like 30 seconds for question and answers. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Shannon. That was absolutely wonderful. Such beautiful visuals, and I just cannot get enough of your line drawings. I could just look at them all day. They're absolutely beautiful. So maybe we have time for just maybe one or two questions. One question that I think lots of people are itching to know is how you became a landscape architect. Could you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I would like to say that I had the vision since I was a kid of being a landscape architect, but I didn't even know it existed. And I was a combine and forklift driver operator, I guess you'd say. I put myself barely through college. I was in forestry and engineering, and then I took an evening class from Richard Haig, who designed Gasworks Park. And I scrambled and switched majors then, and I did not really understand what the profession was. And I'm kind of glad I didn't. I've been completely learning the whole time and sort of just reacting to the opportunities that life has presented and challenges. So no really great plan there, but I kind of feel lucky for that.
Another one of the questions that somebody wrote is, are there books or other sources that talk about Northeast plants and the relationships between insects, birds, and wildlife and the relationship that we plant? Any thoughts on things?
Yeah, you guys, I'm envious. You have some great ones. One of my favorite folks is Heather Holm. So there's a great book, just it's called Wasps, and it's in all caps. There's another one that's title case, and you want to get the all caps Wasps by Heather Holm. She focuses on, I mean, it's just a whole spread on each wasp, really incredible graphics, very detailed range, but most importantly, very specific information about the plant relationships, not only for foraging, but also for nesting. And sometimes pollinator books focus too much on just this lands on this flower, and it's much deeper than that. And then, of course, it's hard not to mention Doug Tallamy and all his completely world-changing research on caterpillars, and particularly the relationships of caterpillars to oaks and the keystone species.
Agreed. Yeah. For the person who wrote that question, Tallamy is definitely a source you should read all and see everything that Doug Tallamy really has ever done. Really pretty amazing. And maybe just one last question for you. Since we're coming off of Climate Week not too long ago, I'm just curious of what are the conversations like in the firm talking about climate change, your thoughts, plant selection, things like that. It's obviously on lots of people's minds, but you talked about it a little bit. I'm just curious though.
That's an important question. I think I have a splitter on two answers. One is we're often in the role on projects when climate change comes up to try to help the teams, particularly architects and some clients, focus on the living stuff all around us right now and not, quote, just carbon metrics and kind of the techie things, but focus on life and that we can, no matter what happens, we can soften the curve by providing more habitat right now, this week, next year, for these species that are going to be affected by climate change at whatever rate it's going to happen. The second, I guess, of the splitter is in the Pacific Northwest, we're seeing our species that are dependent on cool, moist soil, or reliably such, having die-offs. So Thuya baccata, which I said earlier, Western red cedar, I didn't get into it on that slide, but massive die-offs. And some people are saying, well, we just shouldn't plant those anymore. You know, should plant, there's these great trees from New Zealand that I love, or whatever. That's what we all want to do. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So we often are talking about how do we soften the curve, be smart. We're not going to put a cedar, a Western red cedar, in a place we know is going to fail for the client in 5 years. But if it fails in 20 years, you know, if there's a risk, are those 20 years of habitat and forage for native caterpillars still worth it? I would say yes, but it's a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting dilemma to have to deal with. You know, it's like we're maybe not going for 100 years, but maybe in this new world, we're trying to see like what is manageable, especially things are going to turn over anyways, probably in 20 years from a landscape perspective, you know, as a whole. So, well, I really appreciate your presentation. Once again, love all your slide drawings. Can't get enough of them.
Thank you so much.
And, I think I speak for everybody that thank you so much for your presentation. It was really wonderful. And the last thing I would just like to say to the audience that's with us, don't forget, once again, October 29th is our second portfolio series, and then on November 19th. So don't forget to sign up for all of those as a whole. And with that, we will say thanks to Shannon once again, and everybody have a good night.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.